Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Audrey Magee, who is here with her new novel, The Colony. She'll be in conversation with Nina MacLaughlin. Through virtual events like this afternoon's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-expanding virtual community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us in support of our authors and just the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our events calendar is in full swing. And we have plenty of both in-person and virtual events, and you can find out all about them on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop links in the chat to order The Colony. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will include some time for your questions. If you have a question for our authors at any time during the talk tonight, just go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you might need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption live transcript button also on the bottom of your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced over the past couple of years at virtual gatherings, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Arjun Mcgee is a journalist and novelist, and her novel, The Undertaking, was recognized by the Women's Prize for Fiction and France's Prix de Premier Roman. Her work as a journalist has appeared in The Times, The Irish Times, and The Guardian, among other publications, and she also appears on RTE and the BBC. She'll be in conversation this evening with Nina MacLaughlin, known for books such as Wake, Siren, Ovid, Resung, and Hammerhead, The Making of a Carpenter. You may be familiar with her work that's appeared in the Boston Globe, the Boston Phoenix, The Believer, American Short Fiction, and more. What does isolation mean, and how does recording something change the thing? These are questions familiar to philosophers and novelists. But in Audrey Magee's new novel, set in a remote island off the coast of Ireland in 1979, they take on a new urgency. Against the backdrop of the Troubles, two outsiders, an English painter and a French linguist, come to the island and find themselves at odds as they study the locals. In the New York Times, Catherine Hughes writes, Magee builds her world with a rich particularity that never defaults to off-the-peg lyricism that often marks novels about rural Ireland. The documentary interludes, meanwhile, anchor the story in the brutal political realities of Ireland during a fateful summer, while acting as a reminder of imperialism's broader legacy around the world. And in a review in the Guardian raves, Magee's prose is always luminous, lyrical, and pungent, sometimes sliding into vertical columns of one-word paragraphs, sometimes dwelling on the minutiae of rabbit gutting or the smell of Prussian blue. And so now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. The virtual podium is yours, Audrey and Nina.
Thank you. Great, thank you so much. We're going to start, Audrey's going to read a bit to us to begin, and then we're going to get right into the conversation.
He handed the easel to the boatman, reaching down the pier wall towards the sea. Have you got it? I do, Mr. Lloyd. His brushes and paints were in a mahogany chest wrapped in layers of thick white plastic. He carried the chest to the edge of the pier. This one is heavy, he said. It'll be grand, Mr. Lloyd. Pass it down. He knelt on the concrete and slid the chest down the wall towards the boatman, the white plastic slipping under his fingers. I can't hold it, he said. Let it go, Mr. Lloyd. He sat on his heels and watched the boatman tuck the chest and easel under the seat near the prow, binding each to the other with lurid blue string. Are they secure? They're grand, Mr. Lloyd. I hope they're secure. As I said, they're grand. He stood up and brushed the dust and dirt from his trousers. The boatman lifted his arm, offering his hand. Just yourself then, Mr. Lloyd, sir? Lloyd nodded. He handed his canvas back to the boatman and stepped cautiously onto the ladder set into the crumbling pier. Turn around, Mr. Lloyd, your back to me. He looked down at the small boat, at the sea. He hesitated, stalled. You'll be grand, Mr. Lloyd. He turned and dropped his right leg to search for the first step beneath him, his hands gripping the rusting metal as his leg dangled, his eyes shut tight against the possibilities of catching skin, cutting fingers, blemishing hands, of slipping on steps coated in seaweed and slime, of falling into the sea. The step is under you, Mr. Lloyd. I can't find it. Relax your knee, Mr. Lloyd. Reach. I can't. You'll be grand. He dropped his knee and found the step. He paused, gripping still to the ladder. Only 2 steps left, Mr. Lloyd. He moved his hands down the ladder, then his legs. He stopped on the 3rd step. He looked down at the gap between his feet and the low-lying boat. It's too far. Just reach with your leg, Mr. Lloyd. Lloyd shook his head, his body. He looked down again at his backpack, his easel, his chest of paints bound already to the journey across the sea in a handmade boat. He dropped his right leg, then his left, but clung still to the ladder. Self-portrait 1, falling. Self-portrait 2, drowning. Self-portrait 3, disappearing. Self-portrait 4, under the water. Self-portrait 5, that disappeared. Let go, Mr. Lloyd. I can't. You'll be grand. He crashed into the boat, tipping it to one side, soaking his trousers, his boots and socks. Water seeping between his toes as the boatman pumped his right leg against the swirl of sea splashing over the top of the boat. His leg feverish until the currach was again balanced. The boatman bent forward to rest on his knees. He was panting. My feet are wet. You're lucky it's only your feet, Mr. Lloyd. The boatman pointed at the stern. Go and sit down, Mr. Lloyd. But my feet are wet. The boatman stilled his breath. That's boats for you, Mr. Lloyd. Lloyd shuffled towards the back of the boat, hanging from the boatman's calloused hands as he turned to sit on a narrow, splintered plank. I hate wet feet, he said. He reached his hands towards the boatman. I'll take my backpack now, thank you. The boatman handed him his pack and Lloyd placed it on his knees, away from the water sloshing still about the bottom of the boat. I won't object if you change your mind, Mr. Lloyd, and I'll not charge you, not all of it anyway. I'll carry on as planned, thank you. It's not common anymore to cross like this. I'm aware of that. And it can be a hard crossing. I've read that. Harder than anywhere else. Thank you, I'll be fine. He closed the buttons of his waxed coat and pulled on his new tweed cap, its green and brown tones blending with the rest of his clothing. Self-portrait, preparing for the sea crossing. He reached down his legs and flicked the beaded water from his trousers, from his socks, from the laces of his boots. Will you be staying long, Mr. Lloyd? For the summer. That'll do you.
Great. Audrey, thank you. Right from the start, one of the things I admire so much is all the different textures of language that you sort of bring in. There's the actual dialogue, the way that people are speaking to each other. There's the sort of interior, I don't know if it's an interior monologue, the sort of thoughts that go on that almost read like poetry. And then there's sort of the straightforward narration. And I read an interview that you had done, and in part, this is a book about language, I think, and especially the Irish language. And you said something that I loved, and you said, you were talking about the Irish language, and you said something in the Irish language is so close to the landscape of Ireland, which I love this idea. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit to start.
So yeah, it's a very layered book. It's a very textured book in that there are very many different ways of handling language, of dealing with language, in that we have an Englishman who comes onto an Irish-speaking island, and that's Mr. Lloyd there, who we just met, and he comes to paint, and he comes to live on the island, certain that he is alone on the island and that he has the islanders with him and with him alone. But actually following him, not quite closely behind, is a Frenchman called Jean-Pierre Masson. And he's a linguist, and he's a French linguist who has been studying the Irish language for his PhD. And he's studying the demise of the Irish language and the very gradual arrival of English onto this remote Irish-speaking island. And he's horrified to find an English speaker on the island. So automatically, yes, just as you said, we're into these different layers of language and interpretation of language, and what is the purpose of language? Is it purely just to communicate, or does it actually embody something much deeper and much more profound in us that we actually sometimes aren't even aware of? So that because of that, because it's an exploration of many things, it's an exploration of colonialism principally, but it's an exploration of what colonialism does, or colonization does, to language. So that the characters, are the interior monologues? I think they're more interior lives. So that 4 of the characters have these interior lives, and they're not kind of standard interior lives, because actually I wanted to explore whether interior life has a nationality, has a national identity. So therefore Lloyd, when he comes onto the island as this Englishman, certain, if you like, of his place, because because an English person comes to Ireland with certain kind of latent behaviors that have been learned and passed on from one generation to another. And Irish people respond to the language and the presence of an English person in a way that's also inherited and also carries all these latencies. So he comes on certain of his place, but actually also uncertain, because it's not his territory. So his language is fractured, and it's kind of bordering towards the poetic. But then we have Jean-Pierre Masson, who is certain of his space, of his relationship with the islanders. So he comes on very, he's almost Proustian, he's eloquent, he's fluent, his interior life is completely cohesive. He knows what he's doing, he knows everything, he knows everything there is to know about Irish, the islanders. He has this. Only, as it goes on, it turns out that he's not quite all that he kind of gives the impression of being. And Lloyd finds a way of kind of uniting himself through his art, through his work. So, we have fracturing and rebuilding, and it's all done through language. Obviously, as writers, that's our prime and principal fascination. But we see these people evolve and fragment through language. And then obviously we have the islanders. And 2 of the principal islanders, Mairead and her son James. Mairead is a beautiful young widow island woman, and her son James, who's 15. They are an amalgam, if you like, of interior lives that are sometimes cohesive and sometimes fragmented. So it's about the Irish language, it's about language, it's about how we use language, it's about how much a part language plays in us, how much of that is inherited, whether it's speaking Irish, speaking English, how much of us is reflected in the language that we use. And obviously that's a hugely important and still sensitive issue on the island of Ireland when we consider the Irish language.
It's so interesting with Lloyd. I was sort of reading the sort of more fragmented sort of interior life of him because he is a painter, he's an artist, so he's not dealing with language as much. He's dealing with the sort of the visual world, whereas Masson is, a sort of more professorial and writing and researching. So this is so interesting. I hadn't at all sort of picked up that it's a little bit of the faltering, not quite sure of his place all the way. So that's interesting. And I know you also were a linguist for a time, studied languages. Are you also a painter? Are you an artist as well?
No, I'm not a painter.
Okay.
No, not a painter. I studied French and German and linguistics in college, and used to speak both languages very fluently, and that became part of the dilemma of, as I think it hits many Irish people as well. Why here I was living in Europe, and I would flit from German to Dutch to sometimes to Flemish, to Romanian, to Italian, but yet I can't speak Irish. And how did that happen? And how did it happen that we didn't end up bilingual? So those are the things when you live in continental Europe, speaking many, and French obviously too, many different languages, very easily shifting from one to the other, because that's what you do when you're in Europe. But you come back to Ireland and you're a monoglot, and it's just like, well, how did that actually happen? And obviously there's the political, we all know the history of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and the imposition of the English language on Ireland, so using English for legal texts, for business, for negotiation, for purchasing land, for purchasing property. Everything was done through English. So there was just suddenly this superstructure imposed on Ireland, so that if you didn't have English, you weren't going to get anywhere in life. So the Irish language very quickly became the language of the uneducated and the peasantry. Now, you kind of go, yeah, okay, that happened. But actually, that happened. That template was taken by the French, by the Spanish, and brought around the world. And you think you're kind of unique, but you're not, because that happened in Nigeria, that happened in Rwanda, that happened, so this division into two different religious groups of Catholic, Protestant, and then the imposition of a language. You just realize that you're part of a huge structure that you didn't quite understand. So the colony kind of looks at that kind of hierarchical system, and then the impact on the ordinary person as it filters down right down to the islanders, right down to this 15-year-old boy, and the legacy then that he carries because of these decisions taken, and the impact of those decisions and political, I suppose, creations.
One of the things that was so striking to me was, in terms of James, the 15-year-old, there's a lot of different kinds of violence in the book, but there was a subtle violence to me, and it was so brutal that Masson often will refer to him as Seamus. And James continuously says, my name's James, my name's James. And just how sort of subtle and brutal that sort of, on the level of a person's name, sort of who has control over that? Who says what's the real thing? What's the authentic name? And so I guess I would love for you to speak to that level of, I guess, firstly, would you refer to that as a violence?
So the novel is all about violence. So the entire spine of the novel grew out of violence, basically. So I was 13 when the IRA bombed Mountbatten's boat off Sligo. So Lord Mountbatten was the Queen's cousin, and he used to holiday in Sligo, and he'd take his boat out very regularly and to check lobster pots and all the rest of it. But on this particular day, he went out with family members. It was a kind of a family party out on the boat in August of 1974. And he went out, and there was a bomb under the boat. A man on the cliff detonated the bomb, killing Mountbatten, and on the day 2 young boys, and then subsequently an older lady. Now, I was 13, one of the boys was 14, the other boy was 15. And it had a huge impact on, this is by no means a Northern narrative. This is very much a Southern narrative, a South of Ireland narrative. But this event had a huge impact on people in the South because it happened in the South, it had crossed the border into the South where we thought we were, getting on with being an independent state. And obviously it came across the border as it had done intermittently previously. But for me, the killing of these two boys was huge because it was being done in the name of Ireland. It was being done in the name of a united Ireland. I was 13. It was being done in for some in the name of an Irish identity. And I was like, well, I'm Irish. I'm 13, I'm Irish. He was 14, he was 15. Which of them relates to being Irish? So it was very seismic for me. And I suppose I went on then to report about Northern Ireland but we all grew up through the 70s and 80s with this kind of regular pulse of violence through our lives. You'd wake up, there'd been some other bombing, an atrocity, Catholics killed, Protestants killed, again, continuing this division created by Henry VIII into Protestantism and Catholicism. This pulse was through our lives. And I wanted to kind of analyze the impact of that and consider the impact of that violence on us and what happened, particularly people in my generation, because we grew up with it. Many of us left, we left because there were no jobs in the 1980s, but I think a lot of us left too because we needed to kind of disassociate from this violence because, violence is a very hierarchical thing and it filters down. And that's what I wanted to create in the book, was this kind of hierarchical impact of violence until, exactly as you say, it filters down to James the boy, so it goes from the political system into the military, paramilitary, all the way down to the men, the women, the children, and then the children into the animals. And that's what you see with James, that he ends up kind of being, his relationship with the animals is quite violent, but that's kind of it's very violent. But that's this kind of filtered down because he's being kind of, I suppose, told all the time of how to behave and what's expected of him as an island boy, as an Irish speaker, as the only surviving son of a mother, a grandmother, and a great grandmother. He's the only surviving male. He's the only child. He's the only person left to help these women. So he's very burdened, but he's very burdened in a way that's utterly controlling. Yes, and then he's completely to call somebody by a name they don't want to be. They don't want to have as their name. If they choose one name and somebody else insists on calling them another name, yes, absolutely, that's a violent act. But it's all this legacy of violence that is absolutely part of how we grew up, and I suppose that's what I wanted to explore. And where does all that come from? Where does all that go?
Right.
It's where does all that go?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And you use the word pulse, and that is how it feels, as you're reading along, interweaved throughout the sort of lush texture of the actual novel. There are these pulses of sort of almost in a real distance kind of journalistic reported way almost of these moments of violence, men coming out of butcher shops, getting shot 5 times, with just sort of the basic facts. He was the father of 9 kids. And they have this real distance. And I know you worked as a journalist for many years. These did feel like journalistic. The texture was journalistic. And so how does that play into it? How does it sort of live on in us?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's almost personal. That's almost obviously there's the big politics, there are the big political questions that still have on us now in the wake of Brexit, and what happens next and how do we deal with this new chapter that we never expected to be in. And it was quite interesting writing the book against the backdrop of Brexit, because, as you know, in 1998, we had the Good Friday Agreement, this European agreement, where, that basically created a scheme. Interestingly, as part of my journalism in 1991, I had dinner with John Hume in Strasbourg as a young journalist, and he set out this vision he had for an agreement and a deal whereby we would all be in Europe together. And once we're all in Europe together, you're not identifying as Protestant Catholic, you're not identifying as English, Irish, you're European, that's it. And that's what happened. And now we are in a new phase where that's not possible anymore because of Brexit. So one section has left, so that we're now no longer all European. We're in some other new space that's strange. So therefore, the legacy lives on in us. And if you think about it at all, we're still dealing with this structure that was created by Henry VIII of dividing us along these lines, linguistically, along religious and linguistic lines that still live with us. So how do we respond to that? How do we deal with that? Well, some people just ignore it, firstly. And that's probably easier a life than I have chosen to delve deeply into it and consider what the implications are. But I suppose I did spend so much time up in Northern Ireland, and you do, when you witness the aftermath of the Oma bomb or something like it, it is very hard to walk away. It is very hard to just say, okay, that's that. Because it does live still in you. It does live, these narratives, and that's why I write them, these bulletins, if you like, the cut through into the novel. I write those in the present tense because they are still with us. The main part of the novel is written in the past tense, the principal narrative, but these individual, true, factual accounts are in the present tense because they are still with us. And how do you deal with them? Do you just forget about them and move on? And as I said, that works for some people, and it doesn't work for others who want to find truth, who want to find out who killed their father, how did that happen, who need to understand whether there was collusion, who needs to understand, which Republican member in their community ordered the shooting. We all respond differently, and it's trying to have respect for those individual needs for answers or no answers. That creates part of the difficulty of that legacy. And I suppose I wanted to kind of contextualize that legacy and contextualize the impact of that politics on the ordinary English-Irish relationship, on the ordinary language used, the passive-aggressive use of the word grand, the passive-aggressive use of when say for Micheál, the boatman there, he has to tolerate this Englishman's behavior because he needs the money. And there's an awful lot that's tolerated because money is required. So, there's an awful lot of silence in the book because the silence is where people go into themselves to try and cope with the thing they don't like. So that's very strong in the book, and that's one way of dealing with it, which isn't always healthy, and so it is. We haven't dealt with it. Should we deal with it? How do you deal with it? And I think down south, it's very hard to even say it's an issue because we're minor in the whole thing in comparison to what people up north have experienced. So there's no question of saying that what happened down here is in any way like what happened up north. So you're in the halfpenny place, but at the same time, it's still a legacy. It's still a thing that has to be considered, because if you don't consider it, how do you go on, and how do you understand what's happening in the north, and how do you help improve the situation in the north if you just say, well, that's not my problem, because actually it's all our problem.
Yeah. I also too, you spoke a moment ago about sort of your sort of approach, sort of digging in. And James is someone who really is sort of desperate to leave the island. He's desperate to sort of have a life and go off to London. You left Ireland for many years, and then you came back, and I was reading or listening to you speak about how it was coming back allowed you to be still and to sink in to some of this material, and that having the security of your homeland, having the comfort and security of where you came from, allowed you to sort of really kind of dig in. And I think about this a lot, how sort of our external situations allow us to best have the richest, weirdest, internal situations. And I guess what I'd be curious to know was if you felt like your return to Ireland was inevitable. Did you know that you would come back?
I was a real wanderer as a teenager. I mean, I left here when I was 13, the same summer actually. I had wanted to be in the Scouts because they were going off to they were going camping down Tipperary, and then there was a plan for a trip to France, but I was a girl, so I wasn't allowed to join. So I had to join the Girl Guides. So I joined the Girl Guides, and the big treat for the Girl Guides was to go to the beautiful gardens a mile up the road where you weren't allowed to have a bonfire. So I was like, okay, that's it. I'm out of here. I'm gone. So I got on a boat to France pretty much by myself and went and stayed with a French family. They had no English and I had no French. So I had that kind of full immersion thing that Masson wants on the island. And it was huge for me. I just loved travel. I loved to just see how other people live and how other people thought and what processes they set in place to create a society, to create an environment. So I was all over the place. I was in Tajikistan, I was in Kazakhstan, I was in Norway, I was in Australia, I was everywhere. And I loved it all. But I think I actually reached saturation point where I was just like, oh, okay, now I have it all and I need to go home now and I need to process all this and I need to be still. And look, I'm very fortunate. I have a very secure place where I can write, and I'm very appreciative of that. And when I come out of my little cave, there are people here who have been minding me and looking after me, and because what I deal with is actually quite difficult, because both my books, the first book was the Undertaking was fascism and the ordinary person, and that was Germany and the war and the violence of that, and now this is the violence in Ireland. And all of them told an awful lot more lightly than it sounds, and that I love narrative, but I am totally drawn to this Hannah Arendt concept of we need to talk about violence, because it's so present in our lives, and we only have to look at Ukraine to see how easily it flares up again into really extreme violence. So to do that, to take on these issues, I really do need a very safe space, because the language is fragmented, but they're fragmenting your brain, your soul, your body to go through some of this, So I'm very appreciative of being able to return to literally the home place, my home village, where I have come back to, and my people are here, and that's a cool thing to be able to do and say. So it's but it was a return. It was a return. I remember standing on where we now live going, okay, this is where I will write. This is where I will do this. And it was almost like I had filled the tank, and now I'm processing. I'm not going to say I'm empty, because no way. There's no, but I'm just considering, all those things and all those people and all those moments, and some of them amazing and some of them terrible. How do you sit across the table from somebody who's lost his wife, his daughter, and 2 unborn children? How do you do that and walk away? You don't, and you can't, and you shouldn't. So I'm very grateful that I have the security to be able to go back in there.
I feel like now would be a nice time to do maybe a second part of your reading. And I would ask the audience, if you guys do have questions, start zapping them in as we sort of ease towards the end here.
So I'm going to read now from Mairead. So we haven't talked too much about Mairead, but Mairead is, she is, as I said earlier, she's the young widow who lives on the island with her son James, her mother Banny Neal, and her grandmother Banny Flynn. And he left. She washed the plates and cutlery and stoked the fire. She sat down and lifted the charcoal grey knitting from the basket at the side of the chair. The start of a jumper for James. Dark to hide the dirt. She stretched the knitting across her lap and counted. 8 rows done, 2 to go, 1 row plain, 1 row purl. Ready in time for school, James, if you ever go back. Back to those priests and their ways. She started to knit, sliding one needle over the other and looping the wool. They're quietening of you, James. They're stilling of you, and your nails chewed to the quick. She finished the cuff at the base of the jumper and added 6 extra stitches to each side. She knitted on, rows of plain and purl to build the foundations of the pattern to come. Her own pattern, her design, as she knitted it for Liam, now for James, who tells me nothing, insists only that I shouldn't worry, that they don't like me because I'm an island boy. But don't worry, Mum, because I don't like them either. She counted the stitches, 134. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, the knitter's prayer. She continued, 3 more rows, plain, purl, plain. She stretched the knitting across her thighs, counted the stitches 1 more time, and started on her pattern. Blackberry stitch, cable, moss, diamond up the middle and at the other side in reverse. Moss, cable, blackberry. She knitted the first blackberry, building 3 stitches from 1, gathering them, wrapping them in purl and pushing through. The birth of a berry to texture the jumper. She smiled and stroked the woolen knot, a thickening of the wool to keep James warm, as it warmed me, knitted by my mother, though not my grandmother, who still calls this the English knitting, the English scheme, their guilt for the famine, for the land theft. They take our land, she says, starve us, and then to alleviate the poverty, to assuage their guilt, they set us up at knitting. Make jumpers this way and sell them, they said. Earn your living that way, they said. Earn your rent that way, they said. Though we liked earning our living the other way, from the land that was our land, the sea that was our sea. But they told us to knit. So now we knit. Well, I'm not knitting, says Banny Flynn. Not that knitting, their knitting. Their Scottish, English, Irish knitting. I'll do my own knitting. Knit as my mother did, as my grandmother knitted. Mairead laughed at Banny Flynn sitting up there still by the fire, with her pipe, her tea, her knitting, defiant, making socks that nobody wants to wear anymore, socks with patterns more intricate than these jumpers, socks of waves and weaves, twists and turns, socks that sit in a drawer because my father, her daughter's husband, was the last islander to wear them. Dozens of socks in that drawer, waiting for him to come back from the sea. Mairead smiled. At least his feet won't be cold when he comes back from the sea and opens that drawer of socks. She knitted on, 20 plain stitches, the foundation of the cable that will run up the side of James's chest, from his hip bones to his clavicle. Then the moss stitch, plain, purl, the knitting soothing in the stillness of the sleeping house, the sleeping village, her metal needles sliding one over the other to build the base of the diamond pattern that would run up the center of the jumper, along James's chest, still skinny. Though his voice is broken and he's shaved once or twice, his chin only. Surreptitiously, the hair is washed away, the blade hidden. His father's blade without his father's guidance. without the guidance of a man. For the priests are of no use to him, those men in frocks. And he has no time for me Hall, even less for Francis, his own uncle. Though he likes the Englishman well enough. Maybe he talks to the Englishman as he would have talked to his father, a man of little use to him now under the sea in one of these jumpers, dark like this one. A bed now for fish, a blanket for crabs. The wool more enduring than his skin and flesh, than his black, black hair. But what of your bones, Liam? The marrow of your bones, of you? What is left of them, of you, my love, down there underneath in the sea grave, the grave sea? Is anything left, or are you all gone, eaten, atomized, diluted and dispersed, carried from one ocean to the next? Tiny particles of you traveling around the earth. My husband in Australia, in Africa, in South America, traveling the world without me, though you promised that we would go together, leave together, the three of us. But you left without me, Liam, without us. She sipped at her tea and knitted on.
Shoot. I was muted there for a second. It's a beautiful section. And almost metaphysical, this sort of, this idea of what happens, not just for someone who's, drowned, but for all of us, what happens at the end. I was talking a little bit ago with someone about Dora Negrifa's new book, A Ghost in the Throat, and which is also, a beautiful, really lush book, which centers on her relationship with this Irish language poem. And he was saying that there has been, he's about 50 years old, and he was saying that there has been this sort of resurgence recently with the sort of younger generation of paying more attention to the Irish language, of there sort of being this resurgence of Irish language film, in art, in literature. I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well, and if so, what would you credit that to?
I think it's wildly exciting what's happening, and it's very organic, and it's very interesting because when I was young, when I was in school, there was a book we did in school called Peg, which is the story of an island woman living on the Blasket Islands. And I loved this book, but the last thing in the world I would say was that I loved this book. You were dead meat if you said that. Because the Irish language on the East Coast, I'm talking now, was just, wow, it was just a no-go area. It was just quite a traumatic space for a lot of people. And even people whose parents were Irish speakers, they abandoned the language and went instead for English. But there's a shift backwards now. I would say it's not just in Ireland. This is actually happening across Europe. There's a return to minority languages. The Irish language is now an official language of Europe, which is very exciting. But there has been a gradual momentum, and I've seen it with my own children. And I think actually in the space that we talked of since the Good Friday Agreement, where the Irish language was a very political thing. It was an identifier of it became part of the existential thing of Irishness, as I said, as an identifier. But in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, when people were growing up without any real knowledge of violence or Protestantism or Catholicism, there was a resurgence of interest in Irish, and there's a resurgence of interest in sending children to Irish language schools. And that generation is now coming up and speaking the Irish language. And for the first time ever, we're having all Irish language films in getting international release, which is just astonishing and wildly exciting, and huge reviews, being awarded plaudits and all sorts of things. So it's actually really, really, really exciting. There's more bilingual work coming on stream, just as you said, like Deireadh Grifa. Obviously, I use Irish in the book as well. It's just a really interesting thing because it's beginning to ask the question that I've been asking, why aren't we bilingual? You know, how did that happen that we suddenly, that we so eradicated the language to the point now, actually really interesting linguistically, is that now there are now more speakers of the Irish language on the east coast of Ireland than there are on the west coast. So there are fewer people in the west coast speaking Irish than on the east coast. And a lot of those now on the east coast are second language learners. And we need to bridge that gap between the second language learners and the first language learners who, as you said at the beginning, embody the history of the language and the narrative of the language in terms of landscape that's in their language that it isn't in the East Coast. So how do you blend that, and how do you bring this enthusiasm that's growing on the East into the knowledge and the history and the legacy that's in the West? You know, and we have done it so far where we've tried to create these protective shields around the Irish speakers, but actually that linguistically isn't really feasible, because language will always change. Language evolves. Language is a breathing, living thing, and if it's not changing, it's dying. So you can't let it die. But are we actually moving towards a concept of bilingualism, which is the most exciting concept? And it is definitely beginning to be seen through art, through writing, through poetry, and through film. So it's really an exciting spot and place for the language. So,
and what do you mean when you say protective shields about the native Irish speakers? How do you mean? What do you mean about that?
So basically, we have created what are called Gaeltacht areas. So they would have special investments and special status to protect the language that's spoken there. So the language that I use in the book is from Carrateague, which is in Northwest Mayo. I was very careful not to use an island Irish, because this is an imagined Irish. And if I used a particular dialect from an island, everybody go, oh, that's the island. And it's like, it's not the island, it's metaphorically, obviously, all of Ireland. So I took a dialect from the mainland, but it's a coastal area, and it's spoken now only by 160 people. So only 160 people now speak this dialect. So it's captured in the book, which I'm really thrilled about. And other people are working to also to capture it. But part of the problem is it's kind of like it's just the people who are speaking it, that number is dwindling and dwindling and dwindling, because there's been an attempt to protect it rather than, you know, bring it out into the world. Sometimes the world visits it, but really it's in such a remote area that as the older people who speak it die, then the language dies with them. So it was well intentioned, but if you pickle something, it just doesn't quite work. You know, you've got to allow it to live. And it's very interesting, because I was down in Dingle at a book festival down there recently, and they brought in a project to try and bring Irish back, even if you're only speaking a word or a couple of words, into, you know, and it's become quite wrapped into the whole kind of environmentalism, into the kind of youth hip, that's not hippie, but hip, kind of cool. And when you're on the streets now in Dingle versus when I was last there, maybe 7-8 years ago, you actually hear more Irish. You hear kids speaking Irish. So there's something definitely happening from the ground up that's really thrilling. And I suppose in 1979 in the novel, we're at a cusp where it's really, there's a huge discussion in the novel as to whether or not it's worth trying to save. What's the point? What do you even need the language for? Language is only about communication. It's about buying bread in the shop. It's about nothing more. And it's like, well, is it? Is that all language is? That's, you know, and that's the discussion we're having now in Ireland about the Irish language. So yeah, it's a very exciting place. And I say that as a non-Irish speaker who wonders why she doesn't speak Irish, you know. So yeah, you know, but yeah, look, if the next generation feels it has a better relationship with the language, that's a really exciting force.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the person I was talking to was sort of saying that, you know, his generation sort of felt ashamed almost, that it was a sign that you were, you know, from sort of a remote rural area, and that it was something to be run away from. And so, yeah, I mean, and he was similarly expressing enthusiasm and yeah, he was excited about the possibility that there is this kind of this new energy. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, please go ahead.
No, sorry. It's just, you know, it's absolutely one of the legacies. So we grew up with this legacy of violence, but we also grew up with this legacy of linguistic, is it shame? I don't know what it is, but it's, you know, so I have a friend who would have grown up as an Irish speaker, and what he resented was being put on a pedestal as male Catholic and Irish speaker, so that he was, you know, he was the god. And he fled because he didn't want to be that kind of God, you know, so he left the country. So it was kind of like, there was so many interpretations, and this is what James struggles with, of how to behave and what is a good, what does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be? And it's interesting because I went to Boston as a 16, 17-year-old, and I went to school in Boston for 3 weeks. And there was only one rule in the school, and there was no skateboarding in the hall. And I was like, yes, this is brilliant. I can deal with this. This is, you know, there's only one rule. Okay. And I really took from that you could build a whole school on one rule. Whereas we just had so many rules, and obviously it's completely different now. But because there were so many interpretations of how you should behave, that's quite a legacy for people to unpick, and that's what I'm looking at in the novel. Is what is that legacy? What has that legacy been? Because, you know, we fought for our independence from Britain, England 100 years ago. We got it, and then not long after, we kind of brought in the Catholic Church to show us and teach and tell us how to do things. And it was, you know, to some degree, it was like a Vatican colonization of how to behave, particularly women. That, you know, that we just adapted and adopted. You know, we had a vacuum. How do you fill it? Obviously, I'm not taking it all from the many good things the church did in terms of hospitals and education, all the rest of it. But some of the other things were just horrific. So, yeah, that's another legacy. You know, does any generation grow up without a legacy? No. I mean, our kids will have the COVID legacy. So, you know, there are always legacies, but this is a book that tries to unpick and look at and kind of, if you like, to take it to one side and just, you know, alas poor Yarrick, you know, just look at it and say, what was that? You know, what was that? And how do you come out from under that? And that's back to the earlier conversation we had. But the language is coming out from under that and potentially coming into a very new dynamic space. That's thrilling, you know. So yeah, as I said, it's not, sometimes you have to go back to go forward, and yeah, like that's what I do. Yeah.
That feels like a very perfect and appropriate place to wrap up. Going back to go forward. Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure. The book is really incredible, and I hope everyone here gets a copy and can enjoy it as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've loved our chat. So thank you, Nina.
Yeah.
And thank you both. We in the audience have loved your chat. It was so interesting and wonderful. And someone did ask in the chat about being able to watch it again. And it will be on our video archive on harvard.com. And so I just want to say thank you again to Audrey. Thank you again to Nina. And thank you to everyone out there for spending your Tuesday evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase The Colony on our website, harvard.com, or in the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you so much. Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.